Pentecostalism. I actually began as a graduate student doing research in KwaZulu-Natal. And that is where Pentecostalism took a hold of me as an academic topic. And from there, I began doing field work in Harare. But what I was looking at in Harare was how LGBTQ Christians navigate what was and is often a rather hostile terrain of anti-queer animus from both religious and governmental leaders. But the Mugabe government at the time found out about this research and kindly asked me to leave the country. So I needed something else. And I tell this story in part to say I never intended to write the book that I ended up writing. I never intended to do research in Accra. I never intended to do research on deliverance or exorcism. I am terribly afraid of the dark, let alone the demonic. So this was not something I set out to do. But I moved to Accra, and this is where I completed the book Seductive Spirits, Deliverance, Demons, and Sexual Worldmaking in Ghanaian Pentecostalism. I think it's important to note that in Accra, Accra in Ghana, for those who haven't been, it really is the nerve center of religious activities for bustling presence of Pentecostal prophets. So I spent almost a year researching deliverance ministries or exorcistic ministries in Greater Accra. And the theorizing that I'm going to do today emerges from the ethnographic data that I collected at 4 very different, but also sometimes remarkably similar deliverance ministries. At most of these places, I was a participant observer who watched carefully as the various deliverance ministries went about their business of defeating the demons. I attended each of these sites on a weekly basis and conducted well over 100 interviews, exploring people's experiences of deliverance. Now, Pentecostalism is not the same everywhere. When I was working in Harare, for example, the prophets I was working with, deliverance was not primary. But in Ghanaian Pentecostalism, it's difficult to overstate just how vital deliverance is. As far back as 1998, Paul Gifford saw deliverance as, quote, perhaps Ghanaian Christianity's most pressing issue. The demonic in deliverance Pentecostalism can be all-consuming. It casts a shadow over every element of Pentecostal life, from the most mundane and quotidian to unique bursts of the fantastic. According to Birgit Meyer, in Accra, the devil is omnipresent, as are the devil's spirited minions. The centrality of deliverance in Ghana actually extends far beyond the somewhat porous boundaries of Pentecostalism. Opoku Oninya admits, at present, almost all churches in Ghana include exorcistic activities, referred to as deliverance in their programs, since failure to do so amounts to losing members to churches that include such activities. Deliverance, then, is the most consequential of the many embodied and experiential charismata for Pentecostals in Ghana. In the early 20th century, here in the US, the teachings of Charles Parham and William Seymour spread the belief that the marker of a spiritually attuned life for Pentecostals was the gift of tongues. The tongue moving in particular ways and producing various sounds was the initial evidence of the baptism of the Holy Spirit. But as Pentecostalism, and especially in non-Western settings, has shifted to a deliverance dominant model, the spirits and the senses are different. And no longer is movement mostly about sensing the Holy Spirit, but I think actually about sensing the demonic. Pentecostals make their case for the centrality and necessity of deliverance in many ways, the foremost of which is the placement of deliverance within their church services. If you are familiar with Catholic Mass, it builds towards the climax of the Eucharist, or evangelical churches move towards the apogee of the altar call, But Pentecostal deliverance services, it is deliverance that occupies not only the majority of the time, but the climactic portion of the service. Deliverance for Pentecostals is this exorcistic ritual of evacuating demons from human bodies. As one prophet said to me, demons have to be dealt with in a concrete way, and that concrete way is physical interactions of deliverance. In the words of another prophet, whenever a demon is invited in, he must be kicked out. And deliverance is this promise to expel demons and whatever attendant problems come with them from the human body. Manifestations of the demonic can be extremely violent, with bodily shaking, jumping, spinning, or the thrashing of limbs. Audible signs of demonic impression can include screaming, crying, sobbing, belching, laughing, screeching. In deliverance, the offending demon is named, and then the spirit must be slain or removed through a combination of prayer and physical ritual that might involve hitting the person, rubbing the person's stomach, smearing oil, or pouring consecrated water on the person. These physical rituals are often impromptu, extemporaneous, and creative, which is what I think actually makes the study of Pentecostalism so exciting, is that it is ever evolving, incredibly capacious, and thus requires real creativity in theorizing about it. Sometimes deliverance is relatively sedate, but most times it is both wild and it is fierce. Now, to experience deliverance is to experience, allegedly, the removal of these invading spirits from one's body, and to be brought fully under the control of the Holy Spirit. Ultimately, the only evidence that evil spirits have departed is the docile body. Until the moving body becomes still and quiet, deliverance will continue. Up until that moment of calm passivity, deliverance is this loud, messy, noisy experience. Deliverance ends then when the body falls to the ground unmoving. This docile ending is the norm in deliverance. It's sometimes referred to as resting in the spirit. Thomas Sordus calls it the sacred swoon. It's that moment when the power of the divine completely overwhelms the evil spirits, and the body reacts to this overwhelming power by ceasing to move. So while practically docility is crucial, because without it, there are no accompanying signs that the evil spirits have departed, it's more accurate to think of docility as deliverance denouement. Usually, once deliverance is procured, the service moves with surprising rapidity to another scene, completely ignoring the actionless, unmoving body. That unmoving body offers nothing. The primary interest, the preoccupation, is exclusively with the possessed and exuberant body. The uniqueness of deliverance-dominant Pentecostalism is not so much the ability to combat the demonic, but the commitment to perform the demonic publicly, to draw close to demons. Well, in principle, Pentecostals deem the demonic repulsive. There's a strong desire or attraction to the whole world of demonology. In their efforts to destroy the demonic, deliverance ministries end up enacting the demonic in all its titillating glory. Pentecostalism's appeal is not necessarily the power of the Holy Spirit, but instead the enactment of the forbidden, the power of a world that is teeming with demons. In order to clarify this, I invoke the idea of tarrying. Tarrying, traditionally in Pentecostalism, implies the active bodily work of waiting for or upon or with or within the Spirit of God in community. But deliverance-dominant Pentecostals tarry with the demonic, right? Tarrying is this act of staying longer than intended, to delay leaving a place, a situation, a milieu, or an experience. In deliverance, Pentecostals stay with their demons. The goal of deliverance is to soak in, to elongate, to enhance, to explore the encounter with the demonic, rather than race to the terminus of that relationship. If one pays attention to the practice of tarrying with the demonic, it becomes clear that deliverance is less about defeating demons and more about embracing them. Deliverance ministries devote almost all of their ritual efforts to exploring specific details of how, when, and where demons possess someone, making the central point of deliverance to experience the demonic rather than the freedom that deliverance promises. So, additional evidence that meaning is found in the demonic is that the Holy Spirit is not imagined with nearly the creativity or iconography of the evil spirits, right? The Holy Spirit is, in many ways, an absence. The Holy Spirit is a generalized antipode to the differentiated domain of Satan. That is to say that the Holy Spirit is less of a thing in itself than it is the negation of the demonic. In Ghanaian Pentecostalism, demons come with specific ideas, attitudes, desires, personalities. Demons are creative and interactive. The Holy Spirit lacks all such things. Possession by the Holy Spirit alone is comparatively dull and meaningless. So, if meaning is wrapped up in the demonic, what kind of theoretical moves can we make from this data? And fortunately, academics have started to utilize two relevant sources for theorizing. First, increasingly, academics are embracing Pentecostalism as a rich theoretical source to think with, right? Not think about, but to think with. James K.A. Smith called Pentecostalism a kind of theoretical provocateur, right? No longer is Pentecostalism merely an interesting ethnographic topic, but it's plentiful in its ability to reorder and rethink the world and the place of humans in that world. Sean Crawley, perhaps more than anyone else, has captured this theoretical richness of Pentecostalism. In his portmanteau, Black Pentecostalism, Crowley finds Pentecostalism in the world, but not of it, acting for the hope of something new, something different. In particular, Crowley captures this in Black Pentecostalism's commitment to, quote, otherwise possibilities. And this, quote, otherwise possibilities has really gained a lot of traction. Far beyond religious studies, all sorts of folks have taken this term, and there's increasing literature on this idea of otherwise possibilities. And that is to say, in the context of Pentecostalism, that Pentecostalism creates the possibility of thinking about the world in new ways, especially sensually in the celebration of Black flesh and sexualities. And it can be an alternative approach for organizing, performing, and producing thought. Second, thinking with demons has also gained popularity. Bruce Lincoln notes that while discourses around demons was thoroughly discredited during the Enlightenment, demons now should be given the same scholarly attention as any other component of religion. Using the case of ancient Mazdean demonology, Lincoln demonstrates that thinking with demons is a project with wide-ranging implications, challenging, quote, our most fundamental ideas of the nature of being itself. Meanwhile, David Gordon White articulates perhaps the most important distinction of thinking with demons when he writes, quote, demons have always traveled more lightly than gods, unquote. That is to say, in their indeterminacy, their ambiguity, and their ability to morph between forms, demons challenge us to think in more loose and flexible ways, challenging the certainty of Enlightenment thought. Demons are a knowledge regime, one that shapes how Pentecostals think about, engage with, and construct the cosmos. In particular, in the spirit of Mick Taussig, who interpreted the devil as, quote, he who resists the cosmic processes. I find demons to resist a great many structures, orders, and ideas. Indeed, this has been seen as constitutive of the demonic by many scholars. The historian of religion, J.Z. Smith, demonstrated that in Near Eastern late antiquity, demonology had a subversive element. Dana Caleres noted that in late antiquity urban Christianization, demonization was a creative, competitive ritual marketplace where it agitated political, socioeconomic, and cultural realities. And I think in many ways, Pentecostals similarly embrace the demonic and all of its attendant powers of agitation. And yet, little scholarship on African Pentecostalism has explored this emphasis on demons. I do not mean demons here as only a foil for God to defeat. Superficially, many have argued that the primary import of demons for African Pentecostalism is revealing the supernatural. In this argument, one I myself have previously stated, right? Bad is to good, as demon is to angel, as devil is to God. And knowing one side of the ledger exists is to know that the other exists. In this world, for Deliverance Pentecostals, there may be no better way to know God than to know God through the contrary, through the evil window into what lay beyond material existence. Nimi Wariboko, a Nigerian Pentecostal, similarly argued that Pentecostalism radically appropriates the demonic to access the supernatural, nominally exposed in its naked, unmediated presence for the phenomenal gaze. I hear Wariboko's claim and the complaints of scholars like Ghanaian Abamfa Atiemo about demon obsession, and I recognize a need to reorient studies of African deliverant dominant Pentecostalism to emphasize the demonic. Academic adjudications which interpret demons in relation to God underestimate the importance of demons themselves. Demons are not merely a window through which to see the good. In fact, I think that the argument that demons point to God or knowledge of God has been a limiting factor in understanding African Pentecostalism. Demons matter unto themselves, and African Pentecostals, largely through deliverance, tarry with demons much more than with God or the Holy Spirit. So I want to combine the thoughtfulness of Crowley's Black Pentecostal otherwise possibilities with the potency of demons in African Pentecostalism. And this theory flows from watching and participating in Ghanaian deliverance dominant Pentecostalism. It engages with Pentecostalism as an embodied set of practices and rituals that carry implicitly a worldview. Each theoretical conclusion then is compelling in its own way because these theories are rooted in the reality that for many Pentecostals, nothing is more fundamental to their worldview than the demonic. The performance of deliverance, I think, is very different than demonization, but in my argument, the long history of demonization of Africans, African bodies, and African religions is what gives deliverance this decolonial power, right? So if you use the inheritances of demonization, it can point towards the creative capacity that demons in deliverance have as they remember and revise and potentially reverse the impositions of demonization. So deliverance, which is now so firmly entrenched in African Pentecostalism, may offer a discursive path. So very quickly, let's outline the colonial inheritances of demonization. Now, usually when I'm writing, I write modernity / coloniality to demonstrate that coloniality is constitutive of and not derivative of modernity. The slash unites the concepts which are at their core united, but for the sake of simplicity in speech, I've simply written colonial or colonialism for today. So as Bruce Lincoln defines it, demonization is the rhetorical construction of those from whom one feels radically estranged, not just as different kinds of people, but as outside the pale of the human and the moral, a polemic act of reclassification that legitimates subsequent violence against the demonized other. Demonization is an act of signifying. Signifying is a colonial will to power rooted in Enlightenment methods and epistemologies applied to the other. Such signification, as demonstrated by the preeminent historian of religions, Charles Long, paved the ground for historical evolutionary thinking, racial theories, and forms of color symbolism that made the economic and military conquest of various cultures and people justifiable and defensible. Signifying then is not simply naming, but naming to objectify and to other. The signifiers constructed categories, forcefully applying new names onto the signified. I think a case that can be made that the most illuminating form of signification is demonization. It's amongst the most prevalent textures of colonial relations, utilizing a euphemism to objectify and dismiss an entire continent. Demonization, or diabolization in the words of Birgit Meyer, was an act of colonialism that re-scripted African notions of religion, race, and culture as being as evil. Missionization assumed that Africans were in every way unconsciously serving the devil before the arrival of colonialism's vanguard, the missionaries. In the words of Jomo Kenyatta, traditional African worldviews were regarded as, quote, savage and barbaric, worthy only of heathens who live in perpetual sin under the influence of the devil, unquote. The evidence of demonization relative to Africa is manifest through various historical epochs and a myriad of mediums. Herein, I want to primarily demonstrate one way that coloniality demonizes Africa, and that is through a Manichaean demonization. A way of thinking of this otherness through demonization is the Manichaeanism of coloniality, where everything was and is compartmentalized and delineated as good or evil. Frantz Fanon says it directly, quote, the colonial world is a Manichaean world, unquote. In this Manichaean structure, Africa is evil, right? Fanon says it most clearly when he writes that colonialism sees, quote, Africa as a literal repository of evil, unquote. Africans are, quote, a sort of quintessence of evil, unquote. They're the depository of maleficent powers, unquote, or more pointedly, quote, absolute evil, unquote. Further, Fanon writes, this world is divided into compartments. This world cut in two is inhabited by two different species. Another way of stating this, in the colonial worldview, Africa is demonized, another species. In the colonial Manichaean view, one species is praiseworthy and one is vile. One is human and one is not. Colonial Manichaeanism has many ways of painting the African as evil. Abdul Jan Muhammad states, in fact, the colonial mentality is dominated by a Manichaean allegory of white and black, good and evil, salvation and damnation, civilization and savagery, superiority and inferiority, intelligence and emotion, self and other, subject and object. All of these Manichaean splits are interchangeable ways of saying that Africa and Africans are evil. Jan Mohammed notes this in the various colonial stereotypes and tropes of Africans as children, savages, and uncivilized. Each trope feeds into an archetype of Africans as, quote, demonic parodies of civilized whites, unquote. A whole signifying system is reduced to the Manichaean split between good and evil, demon and human, and this is the underlying logic of colonialism. As Jonathan O'Donnell, excuse me, has accurately articulated, colonialism is founded on a theopolitical archive that long equated Africa and blackness with the satanic. I could demonstrate tons of evidence of this. I'm going to skip over some of that so that we have time for conversation. But what is crucial to know, and that many others have noted, right, is that the Manichaeanism of coloniality provides the demonic with, quote, a special mystical power to the underdog, unquote. By invoking the devil and a Manichaean split, coloniality invested the demonic with power. If analysis of African Pentecostal demonology begins with the demonization of Africans in colonialism, it becomes evident that demons hold latent decolonial power and possibility. That is to say, that demons counter-signify. In long study of colonial signifying, he illuminates the arbitrariness of signifying, that it lends itself to religious creativity of the oppressed as resistance. Signification is both a potent form of oppression and a potent form of resistance to oppression. To be signified does not eliminate recourse, but recourse often occurs via religiously inflected world making, which demonstrates the fiction or lie of signification. The rupture in the signification reveals alternative possibilities. Counter-signification is the creative force of signified persons to play with the very signs of their being signified in such a manner that imagines a world free of the colonial order. In doing so, colonialism is subverted and resisted. For long, this was most obvious in the cargo cults, which, in the face of cultural contact and hegemony, created new languages and sacred forms to oppose Westernization. Counter-signification is not merely about revealing the lie, but also creating worlds anew. So analysis of African Pentecostal demonology has to begin with the possibility of counter-signification. It's impossible to watch the practical demonology of deliverance and not acknowledge its abilities to respond to the inheritances of demonization. And in doing so, I think analysis of demons shifts. Absent the relevant context of being signified and demonized through colonialism, the demons of deliverance appear to be about personal behavioral transformations. That is to say, deliverance seems to be about deliverance. In Ghanaian Pentecostalism, demons, though, are not primarily about transformation. Otherwise, much more time would be spent tarrying in docility. And this is why the inheritances of colonialism are vital to interpreting the demons with whom Ghanaian Pentecostals tarry. Taking the demonization into account moves deliverance toward the crucial task of transforming orders of knowledge, being, and senses. I understand deliverance as coding a new collective identity, as embracing counter-signifying, as embracing a counter-signifying identity as la dame de la terre, not in the sense of inferiority, but unfolding alternative ways of being. O'Donnell writes, quote, demons here come to operate deconstructively, operating within and against sovereign power, destabilizing the very structures that require them for consolidation, unquote. Colonialism relied on demonization, but deliverance can and does transcend demonization. Now, to be clear, Ghanaian Pentecostals have responded to colonialism in a variety of ways. One path was mapped out by Mensa Otabil of the International Central Gospel Church. Otabil, compared to most Ghanaian Pentecostal leaders, is wary of an overemphasis on the demonic and instead writes of total African liberation from the ravages of colonialism through a rejection of myths of inferiority. So Otabil writes in Beyond the Rivers of Ethiopia that Africans must reclaim the truth of being made in God's image to combat colonialism's stereotyping. I think there are two important strands to this argument. The first is a rejection of the demonization of all things African by colonialism. And the second is to reject the obsessive cloning desires of missionary Christianity, which imposed a Christianity, quote, so much clothed with European cultural norms that it became difficult to separate the wheat from the chaff, unquote. The demonic for Otabil is the message from colonialism through Christianity that Africans are inferior and the West superior, that Africans are demonic and the West is human. Otabil's argument re-signifies demonization. It articulates colonialism as a demonic attack from hell. The solution for Otabil is that Africans reclaim their rightful spiritual and material manner. The weakness, I think, in Otabil's effort is rooted in the difference between re-signifying and counter-signifying. Re-signifying challenges the original significations, but does so rooted in the order and the language of the original signification. Re-signifying provides a new meaning to something. In other words, re-signification
Uh, Professor Nathaniel, you are muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, please, we can hear you now. Please go ahead.
Many before me have argued for the political potential of spirit possession or counter-signifying in their own terms in the colonial context. Perhaps most powerfully, Paul Stoller demonstrated that the Hauka in Ghana enacted mimetic characters of white colonial agents within their spirit possession rituals. They evoked colonial history, but also demonstrated post-colonial possibility and power. Raquel Romberg refers to this as ritual piracy, in which symbols of power are used in transgressive and power-shifting ways. The key for Stoller and Romberg is that such acts are not merely mimetic in the sense of reenacting colonial power, but they transgress such orders and suggest new futures. So let me articulate then in closing a couple of ways that I think deliverance is decolonial, and I'll do so very briefly. And to be clear, my goal is not to arbitrate the viability of decolonial deliverance, but to demonstrate its opposition to colonialism. I'm also loath to put too specific of parameters around the ways in which deliverance is decolonial, because the world of Ghanaian deliverance is always prone to more creativity, and to concretize them in the moment of this ethnographic encounter would be to miss out on the perpetual unfolding of worlds. But first, deliverance upsets the colonial Manichaean split and binary between good and evil. Deliverance performances provide so much more possibility than being limited by simple good and bad binaries. It returns to the idea of tarrying. Pentecostals do not worry so much about the division between good and evil. All can be good and evil, and that which others might define evil is that within which Pentecostals tarry, spending their time with all that is hidden, ambiguous, and polyvalent within it. In this way, deliverance is not salvation. This is somewhat obvious because deliverance cavorts with the very symbol of anti-salvation. This is not some recovery project by which demons are used as a means to salvation. It is to embrace the most baseless, monstrous elements of anti-salvation. Salvation is a telos that orders everything in past, present, future, with salvation being the progress that moves believers confidently into that future. Salvation fits the colonial sense of time moving forward. Deliverance visits and revisits experiences so that time itself is destabilized, progress is unstable, and conclusions are never final. In her book, Demonic Grounds, geographer Catherine McKittrick extends this argument for the disorderly by noting that the fields of mathematics, physics, and computer science use the term demonic to connote, quote, a working system that cannot have a determined or knowable outcome, unquote. The demonic is non-linear and non-teleological. The future is unknown. McKittrick writes, with this in mind, the demonic invites a slightly different conceptual pathway, while retaining its supernatural etymology, and acts to identify a system, social, geographic, technological, that can only unfold and produce an outcome if uncertainty or disorganization or something supernaturally demonic is integral to its methodology. Deliverance is just such a conceptual pathway that does not seek a salvific resolution, but revels in uncertainty, recursivity, and infinite permutations and combinations. Building on this, deliverance privileges undoneness over the rationality of colonialism. One of the primary reasons my interpretation of demons as doing decolonial work is functional is that, as McTausig proposes, rationality as an explanative order is central to colonial terror, right? Rationality does not hold the same promise of creating new worlds anew from the one colonialism demanded. Tausig writes, if terror thrives on the production of epistemic murk and metamorphosis, it nevertheless requires the hermeneutic violence that creates feeble fictions in the guise of realism, objectivity, and the like, flattening contradiction and systematizing chaos. Deliverance demands disorder, randomness, spontaneity, and uncertainty be embraced, not merely tolerated, and certainly not ordered by the impulses of colonialism. Disorder is undoneness, and the embrace of this undoneness is not a singular act, but it is a mode of being, something to be maintained. Undoneness is as a mode of being describes the deliverance worldview, right? It is not a singular act. Deliverance is a performance about how life changes, expectations change, the very ways of walking and moving through the world change. And this makes deliverance decolonial in the sense that decoloniality is a program of complete disorder. The world order only changes via this disorder, where in the words of Jan Mohammed, the darker side of human nature could be played out. In embracing such disorder, deliverance moves without expectation. Given its emphasis on undoneness, deliverance allows life, knowledge, and history to unfold differently. I could go on with some of the other ways in which deliverance is decolonial, but I really want to get to the conversation. So let me just finish by saying this. Birgit Meyer asks the appropriate question of Ghanaian deliverance dominant Pentecostalism when she writes, if people try to get rid of demons, why do they first choose to attend churches in which these demons are rendered real? By staying down with their demons, Pentecostals demonstrate a desire to be ordered otherwise than the gods or spirit, singular and holy, of colonialism. At its core, deliverance dominant Pentecostalism is about worldings that tarry amidst that which is disallowed by colonialism. We find that deliverance dominant Pentecostals actually use hell spaces and demons to practice ideological rebellions. This then is my answer to Meyer's question. Significantly, deliverance Pentecostals reiterate and tarry with the demonic as a realm of invention, whereby alternative ways of being and sensing are dreamed, practiced, and performed. I offer this conclusion in the service of redirecting the study of deliverance into more innovative and subtle examinations of the decolonial possibilities of religion. The creativity that Pentecostals demonstrate through deliverance is always unfinished, always one story or one experience away from further transformation. Accordingly, in the words of Marcella Althaus Reid, It is in this context that we claim the right of demonologies, that is, the right to listen to rebellious spirits which have rejected the light for the darkness. The transparency of light, which carries with it the clarity of imperial logics and the white access of its racial supremacy, gives a global identity to demons. Deliverance performance is embrace rebellion in the face of these damning imperial logics. And I thank you so much for your patience and listening, and look forward to a conversation.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nathaniel, for that interesting presentation. Apologies for the disturbances here and there. Like I was saying, I was busy attending the other conference, but I couldn't reach colleagues in time for them to come in for me, and I was also struggling with connection. Yeah, but thank you very much, Nathaniel, for that interesting presentation. I particularly enjoyed the intricate connection between demonology and coloniality, and a number of interesting issues around rapture and Bridget Mayer's work around rapture and Pentecostalism. And how that is also connected to demonology and getting rid of not only the demons, but also even family members who could potentially bring demons into one's life. So I think we can open this up for colleagues who are online. If there are any questions or comments for Nathaniel. Let's open up. Yes, Godfrey, I see your hand. Maybe we can take 3 or 4 questions, and then we'll allow Nathaniel to respond. Godfrey, go ahead.
Thank you, Prof. Nathaniel. Thank you very much for your presentation. You spoke more in detail around issues that has to do with the deliverance in terms of practice. But I was wondering whether deliverance is healing in the Pentecostal world from your field work in terms of theory. How do we then begin to understand deliverance and whether deliverance is healing in that regard? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Godfrey. I think we can take 2 or 3 more questions, and then we'll allow Nathaniel to respond. Any more questions, comments? Okay, maybe as we wait, I can probably throw in one question there. I think that's I'll abuse my position as the chair, and I wanted to ask and pick your brain with regards to neo-Pentecostalism, and I think you rightfully highlighted how, for instance, issues to do with demonology and signification is central to Pentecostal religiosity. But I wanted to hear from you, in what ways do we see Pentecostalism reproducing colonial racialized forms of signification that are linked to demonology, especially the clear divide between what is good and what is bad, and in most cases the African rituals and African ways of life, norms and values always signified as intricately connected to the demonic than the holy. So I wanted to hear from you, within Ghanaian Pentecostalism, in what ways do we see traditional rituals and traditional norms and values being portrayed within Pentecostal spaces?
Yeah. and then I see a question in the chat about positionality. So I'll take these three questions for now. I'll start with the positionality because this is right, something that I've wrestled with every day. Before I went to the field, in the field, and every day since. So there's no getting around that I am a white Canadian in spaces that are very much not my own, and that I am talking about topics and ideas, especially around sexuality in the book, that have a long, right? Anthropology has a long history of treating these issues and people and sexualities in just horrible ways, right? And my work is part of that, and I made every effort to discuss it, acknowledge it, and mitigate the ways in which what I'm doing is problematic. My real fear in writing about, especially the parts on sexuality and demons, was exoticizing, right? Writing in a way that exoticizes what is happening in these spaces. And I tried through thick description and all the interviews to demonstrate how this is not really that exotic. There's a part in the book where I discuss how actually most religious traditions have deep histories of sexualities with demons. But I think it's always fair to question my positionality. And of course, my engaging with these issues and histories is imperfect. So I'm happy to continue that conversation. Now, I'll take the other two questions kind of together. I think the idea of like how is Pentecostalism reproducing these colonial worlds? How is it reproducing demonization, for example? And I think so. One has to start, right? If we start with demonization as a colonial imposition, we have to recognize how long-lasting and impactful that is. But I also think that even though, right, if you just take the theology, ostensibly the theology at face value, and the words of, say, the prophets and pastors at face value, then it's very easy to write Pentecostalism off as reproducing, reinscribing the colonial binaries, especially around African religions, but also around, I think, African sexualities, I think around around race and skin color, but let's stick with African religions for now. So I agree. At face value, I think that's what you see. But I think in practice, what you see is very different. And so I always come back to the example of Mami Wata. Mami Wata, right? Traditional Africa, traditional various forms, especially in West Africa, but in Ghana, sort of a traditional water god, supposed to live in the ocean, very mermaid-like. Bottom half is fish, top half is human. Incredibly powerful. And in Pentecostalism, she is the most powerful, the most seductive demon. And so on face level, she is evil and should be delivered. But what you see in practice is Mami Wata in all this power and all this force being played out and performed again and again. People describing her in incredible detail. And I think this kind of goes back to Meyer's work, which you cited, right? This idea that, well, yeah, you take what's in the past and you demonize it, but actually what happens here in the inclusion of traditional religions within the practice of Pentecostalism is that these things that missionaries said were demonic, but missionaries also didn't really think the demonic had that much power, now have incredible power. And by giving these figures and demons incredible power, you open the possibility, right? You create a rupture in which they can have the ability to do things that missionaries never intended them to do. And that is where Mami Wada ends up playing this significant role, shaping things, making a world, right? So ostensibly, yes, they'll say Mami Wada is evil. In practice, she is the most exciting, the most enriching, the most seductive of all the figures in Ghanaian Pentecostalism, which makes her incredibly powerful and meaningful, I think, far more than the Holy Spirit, for example. And then finally, is deliverance practice, is it healing? I don't know. It depends, right? So this is a complex question. And healing in what way, right? Is it healing on a personal level? I don't know. I tend to not think so, actually, because folks' obsession with, right, is not that this comes to some conclusion. The thing with deliverance is that it's so recursive that once one is in that worldview, you're just always with demons, right? The potentiality for everything to be demonic and to encounter demons everywhere really does become all-encompassing. Is it healing in a decolonial sense? Again, like, I'm not very hopeful, but I do think it creates the possibilities. And at least challenges and offers a chance for people to experience and think in ways that colonialism simply does not allow, right? And especially if I come back to the sexualities that play a big part in the book, right? Sex with demons is not reproductive in the way that colonialism demanded everything be about production. Sexuality is with demons is about pleasure, right? Everyone talks about sex with demons being more pleasurable than sex with their human partners, and that really changes how one can think. But does that heal the horrific pains of colonialism? I don't know. I wish I was more hopeful. Hope that answers some of those questions.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Nathaniel. I see obvious you have your hand up. Go ahead. If there are some people that have got questions as well, we can have the second and probably the third round, and before we adjourn. Obvious, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much, Nathaniel, for this wonderful presentation. I unfortunately came in a bit late. The link was not working for me, so maybe I missed some important bits, and maybe my question might be redundant, but let's hope not. So my question relates to the idea of reverse mission and how you can theorize this through these lenses of coloniality and decoloniality. You know that these churches, particularly those from West Africa, maybe mainly from Nigeria, but also even the Ghanaian ones, see it as their mission to re-evangelize the West, which is somehow presumed to have lost its touch in terms of Christianity, or Pentecostal Christianity, if you may say, particularly when you look at Western Europe, part of Central Europe. There's that push to evangelize that part of the world. So how do you theorize that through the lenses of coloniality, or the matrix of coloniality and decoloniality? That is my first question. I have other questions, but I think I can stop there. Thanks.
No, I think you can throw them in. I think you can throw them in. We do not have any other hands, but you can throw them in. I think I'd also throw one. Yes. Okay. I see Bongani, but Go ahead, obvious, and then we have Bongani.
Yes, yes. So my second question I mean, relates to the issue of territorial spirits. How Pentecostalism in the various places where you find it seemingly, makes a connection or generates affinities with the environment where it finds itself. So in each particular place, obviously, one could think of what we can call territorial spirits that they have to battle with, engage with. There's a kind of ecology of spirits that Pentecostalism, dabbles in. So maybe I would want to know more beyond Mami Water in the Ghanaian context. What other demons or spirits of significance that they are battling with? As you know, Pentecostalism is also pitched as a religion, in a war of some sort. Spiritual warfare is very key. I think that is my second question. I can stop there. Thanks. I see there are several hands. Thank you.
Yes, I see Bongani and then Godfrey. Bongani, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Nathaniel, for such an interesting presentation. As an aspirant anthropologist, I'm quite interested to know what were some of the limitations.
Yeah. All right, and there's a couple questions in the chat, so if it's okay, I'll take these because I really do need to head out in a second here.
Yeah.
So let me just run through these. The reverse mission question is a really interesting one. Not in the sense of the term reverse mission. I don't find that to be a helpful term, and I know Jacob Olopona's used it a lot, and I love Jacob. I just don't think that Christianity moves in linear ways back and forth in such a simplistic manner. But the core of your question is really interesting, right? This kind of deliverance dominant Pentecostalism is absolutely making waves in non-African climes. And what does that mean? How is that going to reshape things? I think is a really interesting possibility, and the decolonial possibilities are interesting there. I haven't thought a lot about it, but I'm intrigued by the possibility of what you're arguing. Right? If we assume that this is correct, that there's decolonial possibilities in these practices, what does it mean to then practice them in, cathedrals of colonialism? I like this idea. I don't know where it takes us, but I think there's something to it. So that's unsatisfying answer, except to say that your question is great. The question of what are the limitations? There's a lot of limitations. I think the one limitation, I'll just tell a very quick story, is that very early on there was a deliverance from the spirits of lesbianism and gayism that was extraordinarily hard to watch. I found it very disturbing, and I regularly referred to it as violence. And so that was the day that the prophet had put me on the platform, and I felt like my presence there with his acolytes implicated me in what was happening, right, in a way that I was uncomfortable with. And so and this is not new, but in these spaces, right, as an aspiring anthropologist, which I would also consider myself, just the place of one's body, how one's body moves in these spaces, and how that body, right? I'm writing about the ways in which bodies communicate in deliverance, but always then having to be aware of what my body communicates, not just by my positionality, to go back to the earlier question, but literally my body moving or unmoving? What is it communicating and sharing in these spaces and contributing to these spaces? So that would be one of the limitations that probably like reared its head more than I ever anticipated. There was 2 questions in the chat. One was about if we only talk about Pentecostalism as deliverance or as prosperity gospel or as holiness tradition, are we limiting its dynamic nature? And I think that's a really great point. Now, I'll be clear, and maybe should have been clearer in my presentation. I am only writing about deliverance, Pentecostalism, and the services I attended were deliverance specific. So I generally actually didn't. I attended deliverance services every day of the week, except I didn't go to church on Sundays, because Sundays is rarely for deliverance. Usually in Pentecostalism, it's much more staid. And so I was focusing only on deliverance, but you are absolutely right? Like, there are so many different elements. They're all dynamic. They're all capacious. They can all change in a minute. And never is anything one, right? Ghanaian Pentecostalism was not always deliverance dominant, and it won't always be deliverance dominant, in a way that, for example, Catholics aren't going to stop doing the Eucharist. And so you're absolutely right. Your question is on to something, but this project was only looking at deliverance services. And then there was a question about capitalism. And yeah, I mean, the cash is always a question, right? I generally don't address it, but it is the both, like, not just the money making. I think that's like the salacious part that people get really caught up on. I mean, I was in Israel with Benny Hinn last week, and he has made enormous amounts of money, and that salacious kind of captures people. But I'm more interested in the way that, like, actual systems, the systems of capitalism are implicated and or challenged. But I haven't done much work on that. There's so much work that could be done on that. There was, like, a long time ago, a book that tried to reimagine what economics looks like in Pentecostalism, especially like we have Weber and we have this idea of the Protestant work ethic. What does it look like if we look at this through the lens of Pentecostalism, which we simply have to, given how many Pentecostals there now are worldwide. But I don't think much work has happened on that since. So I'd encourage people to do that. Yeah. I maybe have time for one more question.
Yeah, no, I know you're pressed for time, Nathaniel. I think maybe we can take only one question.
But I will put my email.
We'll be happy to. Yes.
I'll put my email in the chat.
Godfrey. Thanks, Nathaniel. Godfrey, maybe that's the last question for today. A quick one.
Thank you, Nathaniel. Thank you very much. So my question is, it sounds to me the question around demons sounds, in some cases, a demon is represented as a familiar object or a familiar animal or a familiar spirit, something that we know already in the human world, yet it is spiritual. But in some cases, it is presented as something that is very unfamiliar. So I am interested in the familiarity versus the unfamiliarity of the demon in its representation. But yet, the deliverance that happens, whether the demon is familiar or unfamiliar, the deliverance also seems to be so different. So, for example, just 1 minute of your time, if one is being delivered of Mami water, not everybody has seen it, even in the Ghanaian context. So it may be represented as unfamiliar. Yet the deliverance that happens in church A and church B is different, but they are delivering the same kind of demon, and the time it takes sometimes is also different. So just to reflect on that. So thank you very much.
Yeah. So just quickly, I would love to continue these conversations with anyone who wants to. So I put my email in the meeting chat. So feel free to send me a message. I'm sorry that I have to cut it short, but we're just starting the work day over here. This question of familiarity and unfamiliarity, and what you've described. I mean, what you described is what I think makes Pentecostalism so exciting to study. And also why I'm always so surprised that so much of the study of Pentecostalism is so boring, to be frank, because it is incredibly capacious. And not only does it change from church A to church B, it'll change in the same service in church A, right? And I think the familiarity and the unfamiliarity of the demons is an interesting idea. But what I think is where I would take this idea of unfamiliarity and familiarity is that what is always familiar is the demonization through colonialism. Nothing is more familiar than that, right? That is an experience rooted in the day, right? Always confronted. The repercussions of that do not simply disappear. They are always there. They are always familiar. The unfamiliarity, and I know I'm taking this in a different direction, but the unfamiliarity for me is the exciting part of Pentecostalism, not necessarily in the specific demons, but that it imagines worlds that are unfamiliar. And so it's constantly changing in capacious nature is because it is constantly creating, instead of replicating, it is constantly creating, and that those worlds are unfamiliar and that they often challenge, critique, or push back against that which is familiar. And the familiar is, right, familiar sucks. But the potentiality of the unfamiliar, I think, is incredibly exciting.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Nathaniel. We really appreciate you making time for you to share your work with us. So I think we'll always come back again in the future. I invite you to come and share your work as well. And everyone who has attended today's session, thank you very much. And we hope you're going to join us next week. So yes, Nathaniel, thank you very much. Let me leave you to go to the other commitments.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. And thank you, everyone who has attended today. And hopefully you are going to join us again next week. And if you have any questions, like what Nathaniel said, you can email them. You can also share them with us, and then we'll send them over to Nathaniel, and we can continue the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us.